What's up, everybody, and welcome to our first video reading and discussing F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And before we begin, I have a slight confession that I have to make. Before I was an English teacher, I was an English student in high school, obviously. And when I was first assigned this book in 11th grade English, I hated it. I hated it. As I was reading the first chapter, I thought, oh my God, there's no way that I'm going to make it through this book. Luckily for myself, I made it through that first chapter and I got completely hooked and jumped into this book and devoured it. And it wound up being my favorite book that I read in high school, probably. I think part of the reason that I was slow to warm up to it was because this first chapter is a little bit confusing, a little bit disorienting. In my opinion, it's the least exciting part of the book. I know I'm really selling it to you right now. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to make this video so that we could kind of read it together in a way. And clarify some of those things that tripped me up when I was in your position when I was in high school. And so let's turn to our book now and open it on up to the very first page, all right? In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. So let's pause here real quick. It's really, really significant that the book opens with a quotation, with kind of words from the wise, right? The narrator says that he's going to start his story by repeating advice that his dad gave to him. And that advice, again, is whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. So what does that tell us about our narrator right off the bat? It tells us that he comes from a place of privilege and that he tries to be non-judgmental. These seem like positive things, at least in his experience, but he follows that right up by saying that it has caused a lot of trouble for him in his life because that inclination to reserve all judgment has opened up many curious natures to him and made him the victim of veteran bores. And this is sort of like a 1920s slang term that we don't use anymore. It basically means that because he's non-judgmental, it causes a lot of people to kind of spill their guts to him, often in ways that make him uncomfortable or bore him. And despite his disinterest in other people's affairs, they wind up kind of spilling their guts. This, we might notice, is a really good quality for a narrator to have. And what we're going to see is that throughout the story, Nick, the narrator, is going to be brought into the secret lives of a bunch of people, kind of to his own dismay and in a way that draws him into their problems. Let's keep going. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested and I snobbishly repeat. A sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. So, even though our narrator has said that he doesn't judge people, he just spent like the first half page talking about how he doesn't judge people, he just spent the next half a page being really judgmental towards people. We're kind of seeing this two-faced element of our narrator that might endear him to us or might make us a little bit annoyed with him by the end of the book. I'll give you a little hint. I mean, he says that when people tell him their hopes and their dreams, that they're usually plagiaristic, They're usually not very original, and he's usually bored by them, which sometimes causes him to pretend to fall asleep or have something that he has to go do. All these things are not super compassionate, yet he still kind of sees himself as this non-judgmental listener. Let's keep going. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. So, pause real quick just to kind of get us where we need to be here. He mentions that he just came back from the East. In this case, what that means is that he's come back from the war. He's come back to America from Europe after fighting in World War I. And he mentions that by the end of this summer that we're going to learn about, he's completely run out of patience for everyone. He's sick of hearing about their personal lives and their dreams and their hopes, with the exception of Gatsby, despite the fact that sort of everything about Gatsby made him the kind of person that the narrator really has no interest in being friends with. But despite that, he has an affection for Gatsby. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes tens of thousands of miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So what do we learn about Gatsby? The way that Gatsby is introduced to us, the narrator tells us that he should be disgusted by Gatsby. He shouldn't be the type of person that he likes. But yet he's a very sort of sensitive and charismatic person. He has a way of noticing things about people and responding to them in a way that is unique or special. But Gatsby's defining characteristic, as Nick lays out here, is the ability to hope. And I want us to take that little detail about Gatsby's ability to hope and kind of put it in our back pocket, because it's going to come up again and again. That's sort of the introductory passage of this book. It gives us a sense of who our character is and his temperament and his problems. And it gives us just a small little glimpse into who the guy is who puts his name on the front of the book, Gatsby. We're going to read a little bit more together, just because there was one thing that confused the heck out of me when I was reading this when I was your age, that I want to clarify to you guys just so you know what you're looking at, okay? My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in a Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the other founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 1951, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started a wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. So we know that our narrator is very wealthy, right? His grandfather was wealthy enough to send someone in his place to the Civil War, which was something you could do if you had a little bit of money back then, and started a business that still exists today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, New Haven meaning Yale University, an Ivy League school, very prestigious. Just a quarter of a century after my father. And a little later I participated in the delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. He fought in World War I. I enjoyed the counter raids so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me and finally said, "Why, yes," with a very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east. Permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. So he comes back from the war, goes back home to the Midwest, and decides that he's going to start a new life buying and selling bonds in New York City. And his dad's like, "All right, sounds good. Here's money for a year. I'll take care of you." Must be pretty nice. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge, and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. So instead of living in the city, he lives in a commuting town on Long Island, and I think I can put a map right here in post, so I'll kind of put that up there for you. I was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. So he's in this new place, in a place called West Egg Village, which will come up again in a second. And he has he's overcome with this feeling that this summer is going to be a whole new beginning for him, that the world is his oyster. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought 12 volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again the most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, 2 unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour, separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat on the contract end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. And this was the point when I was in high school that I was like, what the heck is this guy talking about? What are these eggs? And hopefully by now I have a map up here that you can kind of look at. But what he's describing here are 2 little peninsulas that jut out from Long Island, which is an island, like sort of a suburban island that comes out of New York City. And he lives on the Western Peninsula, and just across the water there is the Eastern Peninsula. They're called West Egg and East Egg. And he says, even though they might look similar overhead for the birds flying above, for the people on the ground, they couldn't be more different. And let's see why. I lived at West Egg, the, less fashionable of the 2. Although this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between 2 huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin bead of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. So, our narrator is living in some little tiny cardboard shack in the less fashionable of the two eggs, the less classy, less dignified one. Yet despite this fact, he's stuck between two gigantic houses, and the house on his right, the one that belongs to Gatsby, is basically a palace. It's modeled after some fancy hotel in France. It's got a tower, it's got a swimming pool, it's got 40 acres of lawn, all sort of like immaculately maintained. Even though he's living on the less classy of the two islands, and we'll see what that kind of means in a minute, this gigantic, colossal, gaudy, over-the-top, flashy house is right next door to his tiny little cardboard shack. All right? And that contrast is one that we're going to really see play out big time throughout this book. And it's a contrast I want you to notice and pay attention to. The difference between the haves and the have-nots. And what types of things these haves and have-nots have. Because it's not all about money. It can also be about things like class and connections and things like that. So that gets us just a couple pages into The Great Gatsby. Keep on reading from here. I'm excited to hear what you think about it. Nick is going to get invited to a very, very awkward dinner party in a second, and you're going to meet some of the other main characters. But so far we've met our narrator, Nick, and we've seen Gatsby's house, and we know that Gatsby's a hopeful person, and we'll keep all that stuff kind of in our back pocket as we meet these characters, get to know them a little bit more better, and see what they get into. All right? Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.